standard of living. You may also remember that right around this time marked the beginning of the decline in the of organized labor. 1981 was the year that Ronald Reagan famously defeated the air traffic controller strike. For businesses, though, the boom times kept coming. Gains in productivity and automation, a favorable exchange rate policy, and the beginnings of large-scale outsourcing as technology, education, and productive capacity in Europe and Asia developed. This all ensured enormous profit growth, despite the oil crisis and vicious recessions of the 1970s. The 80s was also the decade in which the stock market and financial services industry began their rapid expansion. And so, as banks became flooded with corporate cash and the American worker was increasingly becoming squeezed, it became profitable to lend to them in the form of credit cards, mortgages, student loans, and home equity loans. Instead of paying a wage decent enough to support their current standard of living, we give them credit cards, which have to be paid back with interest. Next slide. So you see, starting at the end of the 90s, we have a very huge growth in credit card debt because people were just not making enough money to pay it off. You have to buy food, you have to send your kids to school, so they did it on debt. This was also when people were taking out a lot of money on their houses because of easy credit and home equity loans. And it's around this time you also see many large manufacturers like GM, United Technologies, and also General Electric, expanding their financial services divisions, which in many cases went on to become the most profitable parts of the company. It became more lucrative for them to lend money than to actually produce things. At this point, you still might think that regulation is the answer, that bad policy since the 70s was the problem. If we rolled it back and set America on a course towards maybe European-style social democracy, things wouldn't have turned out so bad. There are two responses to this. First, the legislative shifts in the 1970s onwards didn't happen in a vacuum. They were the result of decades of attack from bankers and manufacturers, people who own the machines and capital that create all the things that we buy. Regulation was suppressing their ability to make profits, so they politically fought tooth and nail to roll it back, and they will continue to do so against regulations in the future. Given the distribution of economic power in this country and the way it translates into political power, the outcome of that fight doesn't look too promising. And that ties into my second point. Although the way I framed it makes it sound like a conspiracy, it's not. There's no shady cabal of bankers, industrialists, and politicians that get together and decide, we absolutely hate poor people and workers. What is the most optimal way to make them miserable? The next slide. In fact, the nature of capitalist production itself requires that the owners of capitalist enterprises maximize profits at all costs, both human and monetary. It's enshrined in our legal system, too. If the CEO fails to maximize profits for his or her shareholders, then those shareholders have a legal standing to sue. More than that, as technology advances and we can produce more and more things with less and less work, the value of the things that we produce falls. You can see this in action with the technology industry today. Computers, when they first arrived on the scene, took a lot of manpower to build and they were extremely expensive. As manufacturing techniques developed, as the new discipline of computer science started producing more and more programmers and engineers, as the productivity of labor increased, the value of computers decreased. In other words, it took less and less purchasing power to exchange for them, and they're everywhere now, on our desks, in our pockets, and now even inside our bodies. That represents a problem for manufacturers, because now they earn less profit per computer produced. But if a particular firm declined to compete, refused to invest in new production technology, it would immediately be undercut by a producer who could do it for cheaper. This is the situation that capitalists find themselves in. Increase productivity or lower costs, or else be driven out of business. So you see a constant tendency to invest in new equipment, cut down the labor force, and move production overseas. This temporarily increases profits for the first few firms to do it, but as others catch up, the average productivity of the entire industry will rise, and the downward trend in value will continue. Eventually, the amount of value being produced falls to the point that the producers are unable to obtain sufficient profit from all that shiny new equipment that they invested in. They have too much capacity and a crisis of overproduction occurs. Prices fall, products sit unused on shelves. If they took out loans to invest in new production, then they won't be able to pay back the debt, and then a credit crisis soon follows. Wages have to be cut, jobs have to be eliminated, and productive capacity needs to be destroyed until profitability can be restored With no jobs and no money, no one can buy the goods that are being produced, while other goods, the things that people actually need and are willing to spend on, like food, gas, and education, things that are less profitable become even more expensive. You get the absurd scenario in which people want to work and people want to buy, but because of the inability of capitalists to extract the profit, neither can be done. In the meantime, we retreat to mass layoffs, cuts in social spending, foreclosures, and food insecurity, despite producing more than enough food and housing for everyone in the country. And you'll notice that after each recession, employment almost never returns to the level it was at before. Have the next slide, please. So here we have a graph of unemployment over the years, and after each major recession, unemployment goes back down, but it never returns back to that golden era level of the 60s and 70s. So capitalists themselves, in addition to workers, are in a situation where economically they're forced to fight for their lives. I'm going to bring up Reagan again, and this may sound controversial to some of you. He blamed the recessions of the 70s on big labor, the fact that workers and unions were demanding too many concessions, wages that were too high, and in my opinion, he was right. The profitability of capitalist enterprise was being eaten up by having to provide people with livable wages and decent hours. This highlights the fundamental antagonism between a system of production centered on maximizing profit and a system centered on improving the lives of human beings. So there isn't much reason to believe that a policy solution can be found for a problem arising from the system itself. We can regulate the banks and the industries, but once profitability again begins to fall and the economy tips into another recession, we will see more spectacles like the television brought into Congress in 2008, showing the massive stock market collapse and the financial analysts going ballistic after they initially rejected the TARP bailout. They passed it after that. And they'll pass bailouts, tax cuts, benefit cuts, and free trade agreements next time too. Because really, what is the other alternative? You either restore profitability by any means necessary or the whole system collapses. That's why policy solutions coming from the capitalist framework will, in the long run, ultimately fail because the framework itself is the problem. Are we stuck in this rigged game? Are we doomed to watch our standard of living drain away as we produce more than ever before, while the financial classes parasitize the wealth through asset and credit bubbles? Is the best we can hope for a vote for any candidate who promises to stave off a collapse for another few years? The only way to get rid of the problem is to get rid of the system. That is, replace the current system of producing for profit with a system of producing to fulfill human needs. How do we do that? We get all those who've been exploited, the workers, artists, students, intellectuals, countless others who labor more and more for a society that gives them less and less in return. We get them all on one side, and we say, enough is enough. We demand what we need. And that's it. Without its workers, capitalism has a heart attack. But the only way we can do that is through a broad and vibrant movement of working people, conscious of the social and economic power of labor.